Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. A few hours ago, the United Nations Security Council held a consultative meeting to discuss the Kashmir dispute as Pakistan urged the world body to implement its own resolutions on this 70-year-old dispute. The meeting was called by China on Pakistan's request to discuss the prevailing situation in Indian-occupied and now annexed Jammu and Kashmir. In the closed-door meeting, briefings were given on the situation and consultations will take place to decide how to proceed further. Ahead of the meeting, Prime Minister Imran Khan had a telephonic conversation with US President Donald Trump to brief him about Pakistan's stance on the issue. The Prime Minister conveyed Pakistan's position to him, as in President Trump, and took him into confidence. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said in a video statement broadcast moments before the meeting started, Pakistan, like always, is committed to the peace process. The role we have played is for the betterment of the region. Qureshi also said that Pakistan had established direct contact with 4 out of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and they were aware of Pakistan's viewpoint. Before we proceed with discussing these developments and their import, let's hear what the ambassador to the UN said with reference to Kashmir as an international dispute, and follow it up with some remarks by Dr. Malia Lodi, Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations.
Discussions of the Security Council members have expressed their serious concern concerning the current situation in Jammu, Kashmir. They are also concerned about the human rights situation there, and also it's the general view of members that parties concerned should refrain from taking any unilateral action which might further aggravate the tension there, since the tension is already very tense and very dangerous. As for China, I'm sure you have all noted the remarks made by our State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi during his meetings with the Pakistani Foreign Minister and also the Indian Foreign Minister. China holds the view that the issue of Jammu Kashmir is an issue left from history between India and Pakistan. According to relevant Security Council resolutions, the status of Kashmir is undecided and it's internationally recognized dispute. The Kashmir issue should be resolved properly through peaceful means in accordance with the UN Charter, the relevant Security Council resolutions, and bilateral agreements. This represents the international community's consensus. It's obvious that the constitutional amendment by India has changed the status quo in Kashmir. China is deeply concerned about the current situation and opposes any unilateral action that complicates the situation, and we call upon the relevant parties to exercise restraint, act prudently, and in particular not to take actions that will aggravate the tensions.
For this meeting in a letter that I communicated to the President of the Security Council, and as a consequence, we are grateful to China for also joining us in calling this meeting. Let me start by saying the voice of the Kashmiri people, the voice of people of occupied Kashmir has been heard today in the highest diplomatic forum of the world. They are not alone. Their voices have been heard. Their plight, their hardship, their pain, their suffering, the occupation, and the consequences of that occupation has been heard in the UN Security Council today. The fact that this meeting took place is testimony to the fact that this is an internationally recognized dispute. There was an effort to stop this meeting from convening, and we are grateful to all 15 members of the UN Security Council for agreeing to having this meeting. This meeting has reaffirmed the validity of UN Security Council resolutions on the state, the occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir. As far as my country is concerned, we stand ready for a peaceful settlement of the dispute of Jammu and Kashmir. I think today this meeting nullifies India's claim that Jammu and Kashmir is an internal matter for India. Today, the whole world is discussing the occupied state and the situation there. As the Chinese ambassador emphasized, the human rights situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and it is an abysmal human rights situation with violations carried out with impunity by India.
So that was the Chinese ambassador, followed by Dr. Malia Lodhi, Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations. Let's get to our panel of experts now, and we are joined by Muhammad Junaid, who is a Kashmiri academic, teaches anthropology, Jamal Aziz, who's a lawyer and international law expert, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who's an associate professor of history at the Qaid-e-Azam University. Let me kick off with Jamal. Jamal, give me a sense from the legal international law perspective of what the significance, if at all, of this particular consultative meeting was.
So obviously it is a significant development because it's 50 years since the UNSC has deliberated upon this issue. It's a consultation, so it doesn't have the same sanctity or importance as an open or closed door meeting. But nevertheless, it is an important step. And what needs to be done right now is that our position on Kashmir, our legal position, has been stuck in the 1950s. We keep reaffirming the UN Security Council resolutions, and it is very important that we keep doing that. But it's very important that we keep highlighting new perspectives as well. What India has done now is an illegal annexation, and that needs to be highlighted. The legal implications of that have to be highlighted, and there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of jurisprudence on this issue that needs to be done, that needs to augment our diplomatic posturing on this. I was a bit disappointed that Malia Lodhi only alluded to human rights violations. She needs to be alluding also to humanitarian law violations, because this is an occupation, and what India is doing there constitutes war crimes. So
okay.
We need
so
to be,
one of the things that we need to at the governmental level is to get legal experts and international law experts and get them to begin to look at the various nuances and subtleties of the situation and come up with a strategy. But tell me, there's also another track, because Pakistan has asked the UN General Secretary's office to take this up. So this particular move was separate from the one in which we have, because that requires certain procedures. Is that sense correct?
Yes, that sense is correct. I think I believe we've approached the UN Secretary General under Article 99 of the UN Charter to look at this issue, whereas this consultation was done at the request of China, following up on our request. So that is a separate track, yes.
Okay. Stay with me, Jamal. Let me go to Junaid here. Junaid, you've been obviously writing about this. You just wrote a long piece a couple of days ago after this annexation and the communication blackout. You've been talking about this. Give me a sense of what the salient points are and what is it that Pakistan should be presenting to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Kashmiris have been through this since a very long time. We know that for the last 70 years, there have been several instances where India has unilaterally, in a very authoritarian way, broken apart historic agreements. It has gone back on its own promises. Whenever Kashmiris have tried to express their opinion, their voices have been stifled. And especially since the last 30 years, there has been a great repression in Kashmir. I think many Kashmiris would want the international community they've been disappointed that the international community has not been keeping an eye out for Kashmiris. But this recent, assault on Kashmir's identity, because what Kashmiris think about it is that it is an existential assault on us, on our identity, on our political history. They are now claiming that Kashmiris are not even Kashmiris, that they do not have any right to their own homeland. So these are beginnings of what many, including I, have see as some sort of a settler colonialism and a possible, ethnic cleansing in Kashmir. I mean, we have historic examples. I know that international community has many other issues at hand, but and when it comes to people who do not have any voice, their faces become visible only after they've been eliminated.
Correct.
And this, what we are trying to do is to bring international attention to this unilateral assault that India has launched in Kashmir. Of course, India has no moral authority left in Kashmir. If they had any moral authority left in Kashmir, they wouldn't have gagged Kashmiris like this. If they thought that this decision was somehow beneficial for Kashmiris, would they lock them up? This is the 12th day of this lockdown. Nobody has been able to communicate with each other. If they knew that Kashmiris were with them, they wouldn't have gagged us like this. So it is only because of the activism of Kashmiris abroad who are not under the direct diktat of the Indian government that the focus has been on Kashmir in the international press. We expect, solidarity from all all people who care about human rights, who care about, occupied people, to raise their voices.
Dr. Ilhan, Niaz, give me a sense of, from an historical perspective, because narratives are important. And one of the things, because starting 1947, 14th August, 15th August 1947, there's generally the narrative has been that this is a dispute between India and Pakistan. But the fact is that the Kashmiri struggle predates 1947. In 1931, when the Dogra army killed over 23 Kashmiris outside Central Jail, one by one. And then 2 months before August 47, when Punch stood up and, rebelled against the Dogra army. So I think we need to probably reset the narrative here.
Well, I mean, as far as resetting the narrative is concerned, you can go even further back. You can go back to 1846. You can go back to the end of the Sikh Empire and the absorption of its territories by the British and handing over of Kashmir to the Dogras. So, I mean, that's all part of the past. But I think as far as the current government in India is concerned, they are engaging in an act of dual revisionism. The first aspect of this revisionism is that they would like to test what is the resilience of their own country's constitutional and political structures to a significant constitutional change that in many ways advances the Hindutva agenda that people like Modi and his predecessors have been preaching for many, many decades. And the second thing is that what kind of revisionism that they are trying to test out is that what exactly will be the response of the international community to what they are doing in Kashmir. If it is below a certain threshold, I suspect the scenario that has been alluded to by the earlier guest and even by the Pakistani Prime Minister of some kind of an ethnic cleansing of the territory may well be on the cards. So at this stage, what Modi and his brain trust are doing is that they're testing out these two reactions from within their domestic polity and also from the international community.
So I believe you did a thesis which was converted into your first book, where you talked about how India's federalism is under threat from the right wing. Is my sense correct with reference to your thesis?
Well, as far as Indian federalism is concerned, the Indian constitution actually empowers the federal government to interfere pretty much whenever it feels the need to in provincial affairs. I mean, I think in India, since its constitution went into effect, president's rule has been imposed more than maybe 70 times at different, in different provinces, at different instances in Indian history. So in that sense, the constitution does not actually obstruct having a strong central government. What I suspect, of course, is that what Modi is more interested in is that he is interested in changing the fundamental character of the Indian constitution, not necessarily the federal aspect of it, but the secular aspect of it, the religious aspect of it, the civil liberties aspect of it. And this, in a way, is his test case to see how the polity reacts to his actions.
Okay. Jamal, it's interesting because Ilhan, as a historian, is talking from the history's perspective. And history, unfortunately, is the logic of might. He's correct in saying that if you cannot get a critical mass here, then the possibility of India getting away with this unilateral move is very high. But you're the law person. Give me a sense of, considering that international law is very unlike domestic law. It's not vertical, it's horizontal. You have the issues of consent and sovereignty. What possibly can we get out of it, generally speaking, and also in relation to our approach to the United Nations?
So that's a very important and a complicated question. First of all, the broad context is that the argument that we need to generally make without looking at specific forums is that the international rules-based system is under threat globally from populist leaders and non-state actors. And Kashmir, in the case of Kashmir and India's actions, they have not only violated international law and bilateral treaties, but their own domestic law as well. So this is a test case for the efficacy of the rules-based system. Kashmir is the test case for that. And for this, we need to now...
But Jamal, here's the thing you just said, and you're absolutely right, that the rules-based system is under threat. In fact, it's also under threat from the United States itself, which created this security post-Second World War security architecture, and also this rules-based system, which redounded to the US's advantage. But since it is under threat, how do we expect now to be able to actually get back to it and hold India's feet to the fire of this rules-based system?
So just we need to understand that in Pakistan often we don't know, because of our lack of capacity, we don't know which rules are under threat. That affects our decision making, that affects our perception of the issue. So at this point, like I said, we need to have our diplomatic offensive needs to be thinking on out-of-box solutions. Now there are multiple options under international law which I can just set out. Number one, for example, the European Union had just recently last year come out with a policy on illegal annexation. Now they did that in the context of Crimea against the Russians. And they said that in the context of illegal annexation, there is a duty on all European Union states to not recognize this annexation, to not invest in the territory, to implement asset bans, asset freezes, and visa bans on the concerned individuals. So this is something which we need to highlight. Then Article 41 on the draft Articles of State Responsibility says that whenever there's a breach of a preemptory norm of international law, there is a duty on all states of non-recognition and non-cooperation. So that is something that this language, we need to utilize these kind of languages for it. The International Court of Justice under Article
Jamal, I take your point, but here's the thing. Crimea is something very close to the European sentiment on, what is perceived as sort of Moscow's ingress into the, its previous near abroad. So how to get these people to understand that there's also a major problem here with Kashmiri's right to self-determination and Kashmir's annexation. But I'll come to that. Hold that thought. I'm going to take a short break, and at the end of the break, we'll continue with this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the UNSC consultative meeting that was called by China on Pakistan's request to discuss the prevailing situation in Indian occupied and now annexed Kashmir, and also generally about the situation. We are also joined by Howard Lafranchi, who has been the Monitor's diplomacy correspondent in Washington, D.C. since 2001. Mr. Lafranchi, thank you for being on the program. What do you think of, what's your read of what happened a few hours ago at the UNSC?
Yes, well, as you noted, it was an informal meeting. It was behind closed doors. It was held at Pakistan's request, a letter that Pakistan wrote, but with China's support. And so, as an informal meeting, there will be no formal statements, no action taken. And I think that. Pakistan probably scored some points by, since India took its action on August 5th, I think Pakistan's aim has been to, as the government has said, internationalize this issue. And the fact that they got as far as the Security Council, that's something. But on the other hand, the preponderance of the statements coming out or comments from diplomats who were involved in the meeting seems to be that that the support is for this to be handled bilaterally between the two interested parties. That being India and Pakistan. So it seems that and at that point, then you fall back on the sort of traditional positions. The Indian ambassador coming out and saying, "We're always ready for discussions. We want it to be bilateral, solved bilaterally," and so I'm not sure how far things advanced, but on the other hand, having this meeting did put the issue, out there on the international stage.
Okay, thank you. That was Howard Lafranchi speaking with us. Here's the problem, Jamal, with this whole bilateral thing, because the Shimla Agreement stated very clearly that neither side will unilaterally change the status quo as far as Kashmir is concerned. So India, having annexed an occupied territory, has unilaterally changed the status quo. So what kind of bilateralism are we now talking about?
Absolutely. There is a very strong argument that this is now a material breach of the Shimla Agreement. And as a result, there's a strong argument that it may no longer apply. But we have to evaluate our options as well. Every action that we take now under Pakistani domestic constitutional law as well, we have to reevaluate. And every option, legal option, will have high political consequences as well. So these are the menu of options. Bilateralism, do we take the position that the Shimla Agreement no longer applies and now the UNSC resolutions are the only framework for it? That's the best case scenario. But as Professor Franchi pointed out, there is a preponderance of opinion that the Security Council itself is advocating bilateralism, most members of it. So I think, this is something which needs to be seen in the coming days. It's still premature to comment on it at this point.
Okay. I'm also joined by Professor Mona Bhan, who teaches anthropology. Dr. Bhan, thank you for being on the program. lots of things have happened, as you know, since August 5. There's still a communication blackout, and earlier today there was a consultative meeting at the UNSC, which was called by China at Pakistan's request. And it seems that it opens up further consultative process on this. Considering that India's take on bilateralism, having unilaterally annexed Kashmir, that seems to also strike at the Shimla Agreement of 1972, which clearly stated that neither side will unilaterally change the status quo. What's your read on this?
Thank you for having me on the show. I actually am quite stunned by what I call India's double standard when it comes to the United Nations Security Council resolutions, because on the one hand, you see that India will claim that Kashmir is an internal matter. And on the other hand, it wants bilateralism, right, to be the dominant framework within which India and Pakistan discuss Kashmir. So I don't understand how they're able to reconcile their own position vis-a-vis bilateralism and then unilaterally, of course, abrogating special provisions that maintained Kashmir's provisional status in relation to India. So I'm actually I was just listening to India's response to the Security Council resolutions, where again, the starting framework is about how Kashmir is an internal matter, and yet they want to then stick on to the framework of bilateralism. And I don't see how, as I said before, they reconcile the two positions, because it seems quite hypocritical, and it seems they're also just absolutely confused and befuddled by what to do legally and based on international statutes with Kashmir.
Well, international relations realists would say that states always have double speak, and so they look at the audience and then work out an argument on the basis of who the audience is. So perhaps that's what India is doing, is less of being confused about something and more about saying, well, we've given the world a fait accompli, we've given the Kashmiris a fait accompli. But now that we have, let's then take it up and, this is more like, in the bargaining theory, like the maximalist position, where you take a position and then you let the other party essentially lower its expectations to a point where you can have some kind of agreement there to the satisfaction of the stronger party. So it seems to me that that's the kind of strategy that India is, using here.
Right, but I'm hoping, I was hoping the international community would step in. I'm still hoping the international community would step in to clearly state that Kashmir is not a bilateral issue, because the issue, of course, as we all know, is still pending with the United Nations Security Council. So the question of calling it a bilateral issue based on Shimla agreements also doesn't quite make sense, because India's constant, persistent claim that that the Shimla Agreement somehow overrides earlier UN Security Council resolutions is also just not right at all. Because if you look at the Shimla Agreement, in no way does the UN's role shrunk in that. It talks about bilateralism and resolving political disputes between India and Pakistan bilaterally, but with keeping in mind the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. So I don't understand how this notion of bilateralism that India keeps kind of coming back to based on provisions of the Shimla Agreement override the UN security resolutions, a series of them that were passed, of course, as we know, between 1948 and 1956. So
okay. Professor Bhan, stay with me. Let me pull in Dr. Ilhan Niaz here. Ilhan, I want to again go to that point that I raised about Kashmir's own history and the Kashmiris. Because once again, the narrative is, and this is also India's narrative, that it's essentially something between India and Pakistan. And in this whole sort of India-Pakistan dynamics, Kashmir and Kashmiris' identity just seems to get lost. Do you think there is need for Pakistan to innovatively begin to, as I said earlier also, reset the narrative where Kashmiris and their identity comes to be the central question here?
Well, I mean, the question then arises that how exactly does Pakistan do that? Because if, let's say, we take you up on your argument, and then we say that, well, Pakistan, simply wants whatever the Kashmiri wants. And if the majority of Kashmiris, let's say, would like to be independent, then would Pakistan be okay with that? That is, independent from both Pakistan and from India. So I think that is a game which Pakistan will have to seriously think about in terms of the long-term implications. As far as India is concerned, obviously, it makes sense from their perspective, having annexed the territory under their control and carried out constitutional changes, that they are now as a sort of sop saying that, okay, fine, we can talk things out bilaterally. But it is clear that the intent of the Indian policy under its current government is to create new facts on the ground. And those facts on the ground, the longer they are allowed to sit, the more of a permanence they will acquire.
Okay. Back to Professor Bhan. Professor Bhan, my question is, so Ilhan is a historian. They are generally more hard-nosed. But back to sort of the anthropological side of things. Kashmir and Kashmiris, they seem to have get lost between India and Pakistan, and that to me is a problem.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, what was just said was also deeply problematic because it seems to me that the public opinion in Pakistan at this point should really be supporting and mobilizing for Kashmiri right to self-determination. It should be privileging Kashmiri voices because both India and Pakistan have to recognize that, the Kashmir issue is older than the creation of India and Pakistan both. Kashmiris trace their freedom struggle to the 1930s. Pakistan didn't even exist back in the day. India didn't even exist back in the day. So to sort of hold Kashmir hostage to this bilateral framework between India and Pakistan, and to then claim that we can only sort of figure out how to support Kashmiri voices based on realpolitik, based on our own national interest, I think is morally very shallow and not really the need of the hour. The need of the hour for Pakistan, especially for Pakistan, because that's, in fact, has been an ally of Kashmiris, so to speak, for a while. I think Pakistan, the least it can do is come out in support of the Kashmiri right to self-determination, even if it means Kashmiri right or claim or aspiration for freedom or total independence from both India and Pakistan. So I think we are at a point in our legal, political, social history where we do need to shed our territorial interests and biases, the short-term biases that are not going to help the subcontinent in the long run if Kashmiri voices are not heard. I think it's very urgent for Pakistan to do so for its own health, for its own long and short-term interest, as much as it is for India to heed
Thank you, Professor Bhan. I'm sorry, all the time I have. Thank you to Jamal Aziz, Dr. Ilhan, Niaz, Professor Mona Bhan. We are done with Indus Special for this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.